I'll show you around 8 projects, but what I'll talk about in each case is the main question that we've addressed. The main question that we've tried to materialize and realize with a space that has meaning and relevance. Let's start with Refectorio Felix, which was mentioned before. Why does beauty matter? Beauty is very often a dirty word, or at least it's seen as something that's only for rich people. This was a drop-in centre, a soup kitchen that feeds around 100 people a day. Before, it was a very decent, reliable, functional place run by extremely decent people. But, it was grab and go. People spent, maybe 10 minutes and then caught up for a chat on the doorstep and were gone. It did no more than that. But then they tied up with the NGO Food for Soul, which is run by this guy, Massimo Bottura, who is now nominated as one of the, he is in fact designated the best restaurant in the world. And with his wife, Lara Gilmore, an American, they have set up Food for Soul, which works with soup kitchens in different countries around the world to basically bring dignity to the table. That's the manifesto, that when you share a meal, when you share bread, you're not only talking about a functional activity. It's really about creating dignity, bringing a humanity to the table. Our brief was very simple. Make it beautiful. With that brief, we were able to bring in partners who donated or gave us hefty discounts. So we were able to bring in people like Vitra, Alessi, Artemidi, Larusi, high-end suppliers who were really happy to stand behind that. I think we got around $200,000 of stuff from these guys. We did the full orchestration. And we had to make smart choices. Our actual budget was £37,000, which is very small for a space like this. But we prioritized the things that could make the most difference. So plants, light, the kind of details that never happen in social projects. Linen napkins, ceramics, good signage, all of those small details. And of course it had to be functional, but it had to have feelings. So all the time we were thinking, for example, the tables, how could they be solid, but able to be quickly put away if somebody wanted to hire the space afterwards? The outcome is that the guests stay there now for 3 or 4 hours. You never saw this before. And that creates relationships. That starts to build community. It also built a bridge with locals. They were less nervous, less scared, basically, of what, frankly did look pretty scary before. So there are now more volunteers. They use it, they hire it after hours for yoga and AA. More surprisingly, corporations start to hire it out in the evening, so money goes into the till. The problem with many social projects is that they come down to managing scarcity. There's too many stakeholders, they're too slow, and the money disappears in meetings and committees, never gets to the end user. And the brief almost never includes unmeasurables. You just don't see words like atmosphere, beauty, trust, care on a social project brief. They're too worried about accountability. Chefs come and cook regularly. So they have access to people like Alain Ducasse. It's a place to relax. They have language classes, IT classes, because it's just a nice space. What was perhaps most touching was talking to one of the guests and sort of saying, look, how do do you feel about this? What do you think about the new look? And he said, you know what? I love that it looks like this because it shows that someone cares.
I have traveled a long journey, rather like a pilgrimage of old. It feels as if Cuthbert has blessed me. The refectorio is indicated in my painting. They have some very unusual light fittings here. So I chose one and I made it like the star. And when I come in here, I feel very blessed and very honored. And when they serve the food, I feel like maybe I'm eating in heaven and like the angels cooked it. And I love the word refectory. It's rather like monastic. And we are here in that same monastic welcome.
This year, the whole place changed.
In what way?
Painting, new decorations, everything. New kitchen.
The changes are amazing. I come in and it's so relaxing. It really is incredible what they've done in 6 weeks to transform the centre. It's mind-blowing, it really is.
It's so homely. You couldn't ask for any more. It's so homely. People are more content. They're more friendly. They don't really bicker. When you're in a situation outside, you know, things aren't going right for you outside, and then you come into a nice warm place and people are looking after you, you know, it's just a great respite. Oh my God, I remember the way it looked before. Yeah, it needed a facelift for sure. And then when I walked in and I saw the place, I was like, my eyes nearly popped out my head. You know, it was amazing.
It did take a little longer than 6 weeks, but still. That was the stuff they didn't see. So who are we? I mean, we are a studio of 22, we flex up and down designers. We are architects, interior designers, product designers, communicators, we make films. We have journalists who work with us. And our intention is to basically make better spaces, to make spaces where people are happy, that enhance their experience, that change behavior. But it's not so easy because the system out there is not actually, that's not necessarily what they're up for. So we spend a great deal of time designing minds. As my husband who's here says, you know, design is the easy bit. 90% is mind design. And I think that's about right. Because if you don't have the client behind you, if you don't have the team that you're working with behind you, you don't stand a chance. These are the values that we try to embed in every project to greater or lesser degree, depending on the context. The practical tools, if you like, that materialize our ambition. And this is our process. Now, the first bit, the squiggly bit, is the important bit. It's very messy. You have to get everybody around the table. You have to get all the input at the beginning. What tends to happen with clients, in fact, I would say, you know, 3/4 of the time, you get a client coming in, they've got an amazing building. I'm thinking one in particular right now. Great building, it's beautiful. We want the concept by the end of November, and we haven't signed the contract yet, but you know, we want it now. And it's a huge building. It's got the possibility to impact a huge number of people. It's so important to find a way to negotiate with that process and make sure that the unmeasurables get embedded at the beginning, because if they're not there at the beginning, it's almost impossible to retrofit them. So that's also another reason for us to have architects on our team, so that we can figure out ways to sort of adjust the program to add our bit in. You know, we're realistic. You have to work in the real world. People aren't going to sit on big empty buildings for long, but you have to find the ways to get in there. So, yeah. Why are interiors so important? Because the world is changing so fast around us. They've always been important, but they're more important than ever. We are apparently becoming less materialistic, spending money on experiences. Sales of stuff are beginning to decline, apparently, as Steve Howard from IKEA was quoted recently. We've reached peak stuff. And actually he meant it. He's actually head of sustainability for IKEA and was talking about how they had to figure out new models of repair, of systems, of just different ways of looking at stuff. So I think that actually stuff matters more than ever, but we need to make less but better. There are so many issues we need to consider and address in design today, but they need to be part of the overall thinking, and they need to be embedded in that swiggle at the beginning. Design is not something you do on your own. We work with clients, budgets, systems. It's definitely not an add-on. It's a verb and not a noun. So if you haven't got everybody on board at the beginning, it's tricky. Obviously, you know, in terms of issues, number one right now is sustainability and the environment. We are the system, or a very key part of it. The choices we make are part of making a better, more sustainable outcome as designers, as consumers, as citizens. You know, everything comes from somewhere and goes somewhere. My dad was an economist, and he always said, every dollar is a vote. So we have to be conscious of that when we design. The increased transparency of the digital world is having a positive effect in this respect. There's a long way to go, but we are now much more aware of what goes on behind the curtain. Although we are still, I think, extremely ignorant of how things are made, of the environmental footprint of what we consume, of who makes what we use and how, and of systems of distribution, etc. But we are getting better. Another facet of our digital reality is this. I'm sure you're aware of this study. It was done quite a long time ago, 2001, I think, by the Environmental Protection Agency. We, as a function, I think, of our digital reality, we spend much more time indoors than we ever did. Apparently 1 in 4 spend almost their entire day indoors. There was another study done in the UK recently, which actually is even worse than this. It was a study of 1,000 office workers, of whom 40% spent only 15 minutes outside each day. A further 22% spent 60 minutes, which is extraordinary when you compare it to the fact that prisoners are required to spend an hour of suitable exercise in the open air according to UN guidelines. We're imprisoning ourselves. Then, of course, there's the fact that because so much of the time the only thing we touch is our screens, we crave the physical. We need to connect to the physical world. There's an increasing interest in the handmade. Crafts, makers, smaller businesses are flourishing around us. Apparently, in the US, the Aspen Institute has a figure that I can quote, which is that apparently it's the artisan is the second biggest employment sector after agriculture. Have to double check that, but it's interesting if it's true. Certainly in the future, with automation, 50% of Americans will be without a job. So it's a different era that we're going into. There's also the existential need for making things. There's an American philosopher and motorbike mechanic called Matthew Crawford, no relation, but who has written a number of seminal books. The Case for Working with Your Hands, and more recently, The World Beyond Our Head, where he talks about the absolute necessity to reclaim the real, that gives us a certain core, a set of judgments that are our own, because we're in an era where powerful commercial forces are messing with our heads. Last but not least, of course, the boundaries of work and play are blurred. You know, WeWork are not only designing co-working spaces, they're also redesigning the establishment. The world is changing around us, and the boundaries are all becoming blurred. Almost everything is up for a rethink. We were asked to come up with a concept for Cathay Pacific, for their worldwide airport lounges. I mean, I was astonished, I have to say, because it's really so far from the kind of work that we had been doing at the time. But what had happened was they hadn't touched their lounges for a long time. They'd then done one, and it had been completely slated on social media. And one of their directors had gone to an arts bar we did in Hong Kong. And I think pretty much as a wild card, we were stuck on the long list with lots of sort of eminence grise who did lounges all the time. But we won, astonishingly. It was one of those very strange meetings where it starts off with 6 people around the table and ends up with 16. They were still not sure, so then we had to build a pilot. But at the same time, they did have a long way to go. This was the way it looked before. Really. First class, Heathrow. That was the site of the pilot in Tokyo. And that was really our brief to ourselves. I mean, why would you even go to a lounge? I mean, none of us were really the type who did. But it was a really interesting question, because when you dug into it, in Asia, they used a lot. I mean, apparently the Hong Kong lounge is used by 2,000 travelers a day. There, people use planes like a bus, you know, it's really a part of the business culture. It's the MBA set, we decided. You know, they were the sort of foot soldiers of the business world. We sat in lounges a lot, we watched people a lot. We read the data, but decided that in the end, you know, you could only trust it so far, because while it told you all the measurable stuff, it didn't tell you that people were tired, they were jet-lagged, they were dreading their next meeting, and really wanted somebody to look after them, preferably mum. So we came to the conclusion that well-being was really the new luxury in this case. It was not about warm champagne. Informality and warmth of the domestic environment were the most interesting and appropriate for these guys. Mostly guys, but women on the increase. So we also needed to make it hospitable for women travellers. The physicality of the space, the beauty of the space, the unmeasurables, we felt needed to be in a place which actually historically had never had them. Care in the layers of detail, lighting levels, dimensions of seating, because people with iPads sit diagonally, they don't sit with their legs akimbo, as in alpha male land of yore. Hooks, storage, somewhere to charge your phone without crawling on the floor. Addressing real needs and behaviour, no friction. We did everything in our power to make sure that using the lounge felt intuitive and joyful, you know, because those are the kinds of details you only notice when they're wrong. We broke the spaces up into rooms. One of the spaces is 5,000 square meters, so not small. But with domestic touches, we fought for real furniture, not, you know, mass-produced stuff, because A, it's wrong to copy, but B, more importantly, in terms of the client, those companies are good companies. They take care of their furniture. This lounge had to last for 10 years, and people looked after it. You know, those companies would take care of it. Food was another interesting one. We looked into the data and saw that there's a colossal amount of food waste. Those buffets are dreadful things, in my opinion. They smell, A, and they're really untasty, but people always serve themselves far more food than they want, and the waste is just huge. So when we discussed it with our client, who was fab, by the way, a guy called Toby Smith, who was head of that division at the time, we agreed that actually it was cheaper to hire a person to make food individually for you. He was just nervous that the hot noodle soup was not enough, not luxurious enough. But we said, well, look, that's our job. We can make it beautiful. I promise you, it will become your signature. You know, it's healthy, it's delicious, it's fresh, and somebody smiles at you. What's not to like? We did all the details, a full orchestration. And in the end, that's the way you feel the brand, through the materials, through the details, through the care. And the fact that they will let you have a snooze. The thing is, these details are not always the most visible of things, but they are the things that people notice in the end and show that you care about them. Very different, but again, addressing the idea of globalization, was a small hotel in Stockholm. It was a 12-room hotel in an old building. The only way to make it work was actually to make quite a radical shift, which was to have no restaurant and no bar. This is the house from the outside. This was what was there. You know, people go there now and say, oh, it must have been so fantastic to find such an amazing original house. Not really. But this was where we started. So essentially, figuring out how to get the best out of that house. Because what was so interesting about that period, that place in time, it was a 1910 house. And in Sweden at the time, that meant that design was entirely tied up to the idea of home life and the idea that that was the sort of height of culture, that elevating the home and making good design accessible to everyone was just where everything came together. So the idea of making that contemporary, tied into hospitality, to culture, the idea of a retreat and well-being became the DNA. The idea of et hem was partly a philosophical one, obviously, but also, very bizarrely, one, and it was a sort of accident, that we also stumbled across in the books of Carl Larsson. And now, this is a really weird thing. We didn't post that picture. It just happened when we were busy installing furniture. It's the son of one of our designers, Sarah. It's amazing, you know, people don't really change their behavior. If you set up the situation, if you set up the frame, life just happens. But you have to build the frame. It doesn't exist before you build it. The only problem is if you do it well, no one understands that you did it. No restaurant, no bar, but a really lovely house that you can just feel at home in. You can have your breakfast in the library, you can have a meeting in the library. All the tech is there, you just don't see it. You can have a romantic dinner there. You can use the house at will, like the rather beautiful house of a cultured friend with more money than you. However, the kitchen is where everybody wants to go, of course, always. It is like that. And the chefs basically run the place from the kitchen. So there's no kind of intermediate layer of, hospitality staff. There's the cooks and the housekeeper who keeps them on a short rein. But the atmosphere is great because of that. Rihanna, not to drop names, but apparently was recording opposite. There's a recording studios there. And she came by a lot. She was staying there. And by all accounts, she went out the first night, but after that stayed in and was basically hanging out with the chefs, learning how to cook. It's a dream. But in a way, it's so normal. It's normal special because it's a house, just a very nice. But people are the centre of the house. And the staff are not there to be servile and bitch behind your back. They really are there with a shared project. And they almost never leave. And when they do, they sort of join the bigger network that is the sort of bubble that is at Hem. They treat guests as people, not as cash machines. One of the interesting things about interiors, as I mentioned earlier, is that the way that it's positioned is that, architecture is permanent, but, interiors, they come and go. I mean, not necessarily. You can design it otherwise, and today, in any case, in development, a lot of architecture is designed to last 15 years, so not necessarily, I would say. Probably, as you know, construction is one of the most damaging industries from a sustainability and environmental point of view. So making things that last has to be a good thing. But there are many more advantages to thinking that way. This is what it was. This is what it is now. A long-lasting interior can be part of the identity of the brand. It can be the thing that customers recognize you for. It can mean you barely need to do any marketing. It talks for itself. People know what it is. It speaks for itself. This place, Cicconi's, has been around since, for 11 years, so 2007. It's still full. Morning to night, it's robust. It has identity. The staff are not all good looking. Some of them are, but some of them are, they've been around, put it that way. But they know what they're doing, and you feel so safe there. You just know where you are. So they were the starting point of our design. And we translated that then into an environment where the ingredients, most of them came from where they came from. They came from the Lido outside Venice, and the materials came from the Veneto. We sourced the floor from Friuli, the lights from Murano, so the mirrors as well. We tried to create as much of the identity as possible, really out of the raw ingredients of their region. And then we mixed that with upholstery from the UK, which is repairable. The same sofas that were there in the beginning are still there and are restuffed regularly by the guys who come down from Nottingham. So you can support that system as well. But I think, again, you have to not always think about the aesthetic outcome at the beginning. You have to think about the economic nutrition, if you like. Pogo Islands is probably a project that some of you have heard about, because I think there have been documentaries on it in the US. It's an island off of Canada, it's actually an island off of Newfoundland, which is off of Canada. It's an outport, which basically means they have one industry. In this case, it was cod, and then there was a cod moratorium, which was very bad news for the island. So they had a dramatic loss of population. Our client, Zita Cobb, was originally from the island. She then made money in scientific software and came back to invest it in the island. But, she was not a romantic. She was very realistic about her vision. She's a passionate advocate of using design for social means. She sees it as a tool that's useful in redesigning the economy. And she wants systemic change. She's impatient. She sees design as something that's for the whole group and for the long term. This building was built by a Newfoundland architect called Todd Saunders. There were other initiatives. There's a series of art residences also designed by him, a boat race, microfinance, and many more things, layers, to try to bring energy and economy back to the island. But the priority here was to put people first. Our brief as designers was to translate, to quote Zita here, in a contemporary way what Fogo Island had learnt by clinging to a rock. She's got an amazing way with words. I would highly recommend looking at her online. It's a perfect example for a poster child for sustainability, really, what they managed to do with very little as a community. Our job was maybe not design in the way that most of you would probably think about it. We basically had to create a design that optimized for employment. We had to create a system. So it was a design that was more of a strategy, really. Some people might say it was a design of holes. So basically holes that things could go into. So that in the 2-year period of building, the people on the island could build the things that would go into the hole. So you obviously lose a certain amount of control, but you are building this strategy that is trying to create something for the long term. It's work in progress. Zita would say it's the same, but it's got amazing response from people who go and stay there, because all the money goes into the island. I mean, that was the deal. None of the money should leave the island. Many of the people on the island are still making things which you can buy. She's developing a merchandise range for the island, creating jobs that way. 70 people are now employed by the hotel as well. This, I think, is a very interesting thing. I don't know how many of you are familiar with the concept, but basically she was finding it a bit tricky at reception. Some of the guests were staying there and just basically saying, well, you know, I love this place, it's fantastic, but why is it costing this much money? You know, I stay in, you know, the Marriott and it costs the same and it's more comfortable or whatever. And she basically realized that what she had to do was spell it out and explain that this was not about value, this was about values. And that they were spending money on the school, on the fact that they didn't pay the minimum wage or, you know, use unlisted labor, that they didn't dump their sewage in the sea, that they were trying to build the local community. And apparently once people saw that, they were like, fine, great. But I think what she understood was the need to communicate where the money goes. These are more things that are made on the island, in partnership with designers in this case. And these are the quilts that the ladies on the island have always made. Because actually, in the end, the men left, the women were left behind, and they were the ones in many ways who built the culture of the island. This is a project a long way from Fogo Island, but with very similar principles. Orhan Nitschik is a former World Bank guy, and his philosophy is more that a small project is a good project because it can be copied. In his case, it's a furniture company, Zanat, which sustains the UNESCO Intangible Cultural Heritage status for the wood carving skills, which he, of course, fought for the region. And his main intention, will this work, this film? It might do. Do I need to do something? Anyway, it doesn't matter if it doesn't. No, I'm going to move on. Oh, now it does. He did 2 clicks. His intention is that young Bosnians can see a future in their country and a future for craft and design, because I'm sure, as you're aware, it's an area that was devastated by war. There was no jobs, totally destroyed. So, you know, this is not a romantic initiative. Any design that we did had to have commercial success in its sites. It had to be visible and valuable. So we figured out a way to if you like, represent these wood carving skills in a collection called Touch. As you can imagine, it's highly tactile. You just immediately want to stroke it. But it's also using their skills optimally, using enough to give the pieces value, but not so much that they become outrageously expensive to make them still viable. This sentiment, I think, is a really interesting one when it comes to design, because we often categorize things in sort of social structures, which is understandable, but how do you deal with something like this, for example? You know, we think of yachts as being sort of, you know, for the super rich and therefore in some way not, you know, relevant maybe for the design profession, I mean, or maybe not, I don't know. But some might think that. This is an amazing project. It's a renovation of a 1930s motor yacht, Shamara. And the guy who owns it did the project deliberately in the UK, in Portsmouth, to give work to what's actually quite a depressed area of the UK, and more importantly, to sustain this kind of boat-making skills, which we're, you know, running out of possibilities since that industry is now mostly in other countries. It was amazing seeing it rebuilt. I mean, it was, you know, more a build than a renovation, because initially it was all riveted and it had to be welded. Incredible process. So many people involved, so many skills. And it's now a really beautiful thing that would otherwise have just sunk in a rusty pile, and those skills would not have had anybody to sustain them. So I think, yes, luxury can have meaning, but only if it makes a point of sustaining the skills that in former years would have had patrons and today rarely do. At the very opposite end of the scale, another hot potato, which I'm sure I'll have questions on afterwards. But can mass production be good? You would think not. And IKEA is often seen as the big bad, you know, of all of them. Apparently, someone told me that if you added up all of the design firms in the world, the sum total would still be a tenth of what IKEA produces, and I think it's more than that now. I think it's because they're now in India and so on. I mean, it's huge. You can't, you know, it is what it is. But it was really interesting when they came to us, because it was compelling to see if it was possible to do affordable, sustainable, functional, good-looking furniture. You know, something that was part of their main range, not a sort of marketing thing. We work with cork, which actually is a fully circular material. There is no waste in the wake of not using it for corks anymore, wine bottle corks. There's been a lot of research into using it as a solid, a laminate, a fabric, etc. I mean, everything's reused. But we also used other natural materials like ceramic, hemp, bamboo, glass, etc. So all of the materials are, you know, good materials. We went to the factories, we checked the factories. We launched 30 pieces in natural materials. It took 3 years. And it was a fascinating experience. We wanted to make things that would be background pieces, if you like, but that had a tactility, a warmth, a comfort that you could get from those materials. The process was quite extraordinary. That was kind of not untypical. Robust democracy, I think, is what they call it. Everybody who has a part in the process is there. The lorry driver, distribution, logistics, human rights, raw materials, volume, waste, environment, you name it. Coatings, Lars from Coatings was one of my favourites. He had a suitcase and we'd go, that's nice, and he'd go, bad. And then he'd point to something, properly ugly, and he'd say, good. So we'd go, okay, we like good, but we want it to look as good as bad. And then, literally sort of a year later, we had something that was actually really pretty close to both. And actually, if I'm honest about it, that was our real achievement, was finding and pushing them on those small details like coatings, also for the cork, because cork coated in layers of plastic is really not nice, but you understand why, because it has to meet all of these hygiene regs and all the de-risking that goes on with a company that works on an international scale. They would go for the easier option. Of course they would. But we really pushed them, and they wanted us to. That was why they were with us, to develop something that was more tactile, more natural, wax-based, but still met the regs. And they did. It just took a long time. But in the end, I think that's our real achievement. You'll see those coatings now pretty much on all of their products, which is why their stuff feels so much better than it did. And this was the outcome. It was there for 2 years. Sadly, the bad side of the big bad company is 2 years is pretty much your limit. There's a few things still there. But you can get them on eBay and they're worth a fortune. I have to say, we can get very happy when you see that. Yeah. Stuff matters. This is a tiny flat in Milan that we did, 43 square meters. It shows the stuff matters for everyone. It's not just for people with deep pockets. It's also why we did the IKEA project. We wanted to prove that design could matter for people with lower incomes. You could make it work. A former garage, now a tiny apartment. Design can make a difference. It gives shape, it realizes and materializes our life. Finally, a glimpse into the future. A few names I think you should look out for. These are a few graduates of the Design Academy Eindhoven from the Department of Man and Wellbeing. Far too many words, but basically this is what our syllabus looks like. You start at 1 o'clock and make your way through materials, through human needs to the system over a course that lasts 4.5 years or so. And these are some of the people who've been through it. This girl did a study on Apple, or more specifically on Foxconn. She's sort of a journalist designer, very much in the school of what I was talking about earlier in terms of visibility and transparency and the questions. 5,000 times is probably not entirely scientific calculation, but one that she made by looking at engineers' movies of Foxconn. So she's extremely persistent clipping these bits together, because as you know, Apple are particularly protective of their privacy in manufacturing. And 5,000 times was the number of times she figured that when making an iPhone, somebody had to mark areas for assembly. Apparently, there was somebody else who she reckoned took 3,800 pictures per day on a phone to check it. So once in a blue moon, you might actually get that picture still on your phone because it hasn't been wiped. She also did another study of a MacBook Pro where she pulled it apart and looked at the tape and saw that there was a zigzag on the tape, on the caption tape, and she could see that basically it was obviously somebody's job, or maybe many people's job, to tear bits of tape off to assemble it. So these things are not made by machine, they are made by people. The software, no, but they are assembled by people. And she was just curious to show that we have really these walls, these veils between us and how things are made. So her whole project really is to sort of make that more visible. She estimated that 325 people work on one iPad, for example. Then it comes down to materials. There are a lot of students working with materials right now, and that's for a reason. I think the future of materials is one of the great prairies of the future of design. This is a guy who is working upcycling rather, building materials. As we mentioned earlier, it's one of the most environmentally damaging of industries. So he makes beautiful materials out of waste to make buildings that will last. So they're not just a sort of gimmick. And they're used now extensively in new buildings. This is a recent graduate, Agni Kutran-Keita, who has a project which turns the idea of glazing ceramics on its head. As you may know, glazing makes metal safe. That's what glazing is. So she turned it round and basically identifies toxic waste sites, whether it's waste from industry or water, and makes those metal dumps safe through glazing. And they're incredibly beautiful. Actually, the more toxic the waste, the more beautiful the glaze. It's very bizarre, but true. And this is a bar she's completed recently in Rotterdam. You lose control in some way of the perfect end result, but you end up with something far more beautiful in another way. Don Quaning, who's worked with Forbo, the linoleum company. As you know, linoleum's an environmentally sound material, but he's been working with them to add depth, flexibility, texture, using other materials like wood and limestone to make what's essentially a lino leather. It's really beautiful and an industrial product. Urtica, Nina Gautier, who works with nettle, which was one of those plants or fabrics rather that was sort of, beaten up by the cotton industry. And her point is to show that not only can you make amazing textiles from it, but you have this extraordinary biodiversity that goes with it. So it, provides everything from sort of food to dyes to medicines to teas. It liberates a whole range of outcomes that the monocrop, cash crop culture we have right now does not. And lastly, Tamara Ojola, forest wool. She's from Latvia, and there, obviously there's a lot of forestry. She estimates that in Europe, the 600 million pine trees are cut down every year. In the process, tons of pine needles are left on the floor. So she was basically researching different outcomes that you could get from that waste using standard manufacturing techniques like crushing, soaking, steaming, etc., to transform them into textiles, composites, paper, etc. I think these are going to be the big moves. They've been, slightly marginalized by regulation, but I think we'll see much more of this So, yeah, to sum up, I think the design of interiors, I think I've made my case, and the stuff that goes into them really does matter. We're not going to be sitting on an app anytime soon. But it needs to be more sustainable, well-designed, well-made stuff. Stuff that changes the way we do things, that considers our needs, that changes our behaviours, and that we enjoy. You know, hair shirt is never going to work. This is the kind of stuff that lasts, and the kind of stuff that hopefully will replace the really bad stuff out there. Thank you very much.
My question for you, you mentioned at the beginning that 90% of what you do is mind design.
Absolutely.
What recommendations would you make for people who maybe haven't developed their network as much yet or have entrenched themselves in their industry already? How do you find those people who are willing to think differently?
Very good question, and it's actually one we discuss in the studio quite a lot, because some of the younger ones come in and say things like, yeah, but we only want to work with clients who think the way we do, and it's just like, good luck. Once in a blue moon you do get someone like that, but mostly it's a question of finding people who you think have the ambition to make a difference. That for sure you need. And then we do a lot of listening. We ask a lot of questions. We watch. You know, we talk about the sort of 2 eyes, 2 ears, and 1 mouth. We really try not to jump to conclusions until we've properly taken on board what's going on, and then we try to find a solution for them. Then I think you've got a foundation to be able to work together, because ultimately building, as we do, whether it's a product or a building, is a collaboration. I mean, you're doing it together. I mean, buildings cost so much money, there's so much time, there's so much at stake. So you know, it's really working together from the very beginning. And I have to say, I think that design courses sometimes don't, I wouldn't say teach that enough, because I think that's quite hard to do until you're faced with it, but I think don't necessarily make it clear that that is going to be an element, an important element of what happens next, and maybe offer mentoring programs or something, because you cannot design until you've won trust. That's it, really.
In working with Elle before starting your own studio, is there kind of the way that you look back at them and the way that they present interior design and those kinds of things, do you kind of question the way that they're presenting interiors, or is there kind of a pushback, like what is your narrative with them?
So you're saying that before I did my own studio, was I questioning the way the interiors were?
More so just the way that Elle presents interior design, and now...
Oh, Elle, sorry.
Yes, Elle,
Yeah.
yes, sorry. And then the way that they're presenting kind of this materialistic notion of humans, and you were kind of saying that we're moving away from that. Do you see that you kind of have this opportunity to have a conversation with interior design magazines, or the way that the larger mass sees interiors?
I try to do that with many media, like this, for example. So we are always trying to tell the story of things that last longer and that are not ephemeral. And I must say that was one of the things that, in the end, made me realise that magazines were really not my thing. You know, I was a journalist. I love to write. I love to write about ideas. And me and a group of art school students started Elle Decoration in the UK. We had no idea it would become as successful as it did. And I must say, you know, it's that sort of a whole other thing to the thing we thought it was, if you know what I mean. You know, we were there painting backdrops and moving interesting people in and out of the space and interesting furniture out of the space. So it turned into something very different. And I don't personally think that interiors should be entirely driven by fashion. I think they need to be responsive, they need to reflect the times they're in, they need to be a platform for talent and ideas, but that's not the same as that rapid turnover that's sort of essentially a function of fast fashion.
Hi. So I'm a parishioner at a church here in the city, St. Francis de Sales, and it's a beautiful space, but there's a lot of things sort of falling apart, or ways in which the space isn't being used to its full potential, I guess. And I'm wondering if you have advice for places that don't have a lot of funds, how to start sort of small from the ground up, kind of incorporating the sense of the person and dignity and beauty, maybe in places where there isn't a potential yet to sort of do a kind of full transformation like what your studio does.
I think time is your friend. I think don't be in a hurry, but I would say basics, if you can afford to do it, are floor and lighting. That changes everything immediately. And then I would go, I would cut out the middle ground, if you like, and go to the things you do every day. Just do a list of the things you touch every day, from the point where you wake up, the point you go to sleep. And if you systematically make those experiences special, I think you will feel completely different about the space you're in. I mean, think about going to a restaurant, for example, which might be amazing looking around you, but actually the things on your table are really pretty average and disgusting. I mean, the difference between that and something quite simple, but with real care put into things that have been considered but aren't necessarily expensive. So it's not about money, but I think it is about the things that matter to you and getting those right. And then the rest can happen when you can afford it later.
Yes, your famous Italian chef was on 60 Minutes this past Sunday, selling his meals, his creations for $500 a meal, and then his people would then make these meals for, and you didn't clarify whether they were homeless or just poor or what, or do they have anything? Do they participate in the creation at all, or are they just the consumers? Because we have a lot of things in Philadelphia where we just redistribute the food to people in bulk. And it would seem to me that if you are making $500 a meal, creating these beautiful things, it would be much more of a practical thing for you to contribute your money to these agencies and let them just give people something to eat, because I think all those people at those tables just want something to eat. They don't care whether it's a world-famous chef necessarily, or are you marketing the chef, the design of the food as the part of the distribution chain? And do the consumers participate in the creation of the product at all? Do they learn anything where they get some long-term benefit out of sustainability and creating an occupation or something else? We have a lot of things that you see on TV in Philadelphia where the homeless and the poor people are actually participating in making the meals and things like that. And I think there's so little about the design of the creation. But so I would question that Italian chef, even though he's now #1 in the world, at $500 a meal. And the creations are quite good looking, but I would rather have him give his money to Project Home or one of these people that if you see the amount of food that's being redistributed around Philadelphia, you'll be quite impressed, I think. So my question to you is...
I understand your skepticism, and I can totally relate to it. I think you have to look at it in pieces. Massimo's a chef, and he does, it's true, sell expensive meals, which take a lot of time to make, and you might buy into that or not buy into that, but it's a thing. And he trains a lot of people who love to cook, the chef industry. He's not necessarily massively wealthy himself. I mean, I haven't looked at his bank account, but I don't think so. I think he's a top chef, but that doesn't make him a millionaire. What he does have, though, is a very strong-minded wife, and also the power to get people behind him. So actually, for example, to your point, in all of his projects, he works with an existing soup kitchen. He doesn't believe in a gimmick starting something new. And he works with the agencies you'll talk about. So here, Project Felix is exactly what you say. They get supermarket waste food from all the local retailers that would otherwise be chucked out. And that's what gets brought into the centre. So he brings those, he makes those links come together. So he's not trying to make something that replaces the infrastructure. He really tries to make something that optimizes the infrastructure and delivers more, really, because, I mean, what was there was a soup kitchen, and you're right, the people want to go there to eat, but they do also want to go there to be friends, to feel that somebody says hello, who knows their name. They also, if they want to, can work in the kitchen. Many of them do volunteer in the kitchen. They can also learn a language. Lots of them don't speak English. You know, it is because of the way it's designed, and I don't think that it's only about the design. It really isn't. But what the design has done, I think, is create a space that feels more inviting. It's built a bridge with the community. It's brought in outsiders who've brought in, you know, like Beecher and so on, who've given donations of furniture, which they wouldn't have otherwise done. You know, everybody wants a little bit of a feeling of being in an environment that feels comfortable for them. And it's repeatable. I mean, he's getting Rockefeller Foundation money to do it in the US, because I think there are a lot of those things that exist, but they're not communities. They serve a function and only a function, but they don't build the possibility of creating spaces where people can help each other, because they're too soulless. You know, you don't want to spend time in there. So I think that what design can do here is bring people together or help to make spaces. They don't do it, but they can make spaces where people can feel comfortable and get to know each other. Because I've got a friend who's doing a big study really on how to make the welfare state in the UK more functional, because it's becoming very dysfunctional. And she says one of the problems with the way we look at the welfare state is it's always about managing scarcity. On the one hand, you've either got not enough money, or on the other hand, you throw money at something, but it's not the solution, she says. The solution is to get people to help each other. And that's what he's trying to do.
Thanks so much for this presentation. I have I think maybe like a bit of a related question to the previous one in terms of this tension between the elite patrons of kind of luxurious or rarefied design objects, you know, as well as the you know, theme of social design and democratizing kind of access to beautiful spaces. I felt like you made an extremely, you know, compelling case that not only is kind of nice, enjoyable, pleasurable design for everybody, but that the spaces you work on should have an ethics of kind of care and community, whether it's in the whether it's the soup kitchen or, you know, the cold, hostile environment of an airport lounge. What I guess I'm curious about, though, is kind of how this idea can scale kind of beyond the environment in which either a corporate client can afford to engage you, or you know, a peer firm, or a nonprofit community center has a charismatic leader like the chef who's able to engage someone like yourself. I mean, that's not everybody. And I'm just kind of curious along the lines of the IKEA experiments, if you thought about how this kind of, you know, this design philosophy, and especially around kind of care and comfort and kind of social, you know, community can scale.
We are working for a more traditional social enterprise at the moment, and I must say it's extremely tough. Because, as you can imagine, the system there, quite understandably, is set up to avoid risk and to basically manage what is never very much money. The problem is often that the contractual nature of that sort of setup means that money gets completely lost, as I said, in committees around accountability, around risk, in markups that are there in order to protect clients from any outcomes from a construction perspective, but actually can end up covering many other areas, which means that not enough of the budget actually reaches the end user. So it's a very complicated setup. I think there is good design beginning to move into that area. I mean, we've seen some very good hospitals built in the UK recently, so it's happening. But if you talk to the designers, you definitely have to start to try to change the system of procuring design, because the traditional system of procuring design is pretty tough. And it doesn't prioritize design. It tends to be design for facilities managers. And that needs to change. And I think the only way it can change is if people get together at the beginning and try to figure that out. The big companies like IKEA are certainly one way to reach people with lower incomes, which is why I was really interested to see if we could work with them in a way that had a good outcome in every respect. And interestingly, they are moving into, I mean, they're Swedish, so, it helps, but they are moving much more into the social sector in terms of sort of looking at housing. They are changing their restaurants. We worked on a strategy for that. They are moving to 80% vegetarian within the next decade. So they have made various commitments to elevating their outcome, not just their output. Steve Howard, as I said, the sustainability guy, is on the board. He's not just decoration. So I think, things are changing, things are happening, but it's tough. It's tough, as you say, and I think certainly what we always try to do is, even with our upscale clients, is make sure that the money is used, if you like, as economic nutrition to support smaller companies that need support, and not just sort of churn out generic stuff, copies or whatever, that actually the money goes into supporting jobs where they're needed. Because ultimately, like my dad said, every dollar's a vote.
Thank you for the wonderful lecture. I would like to ask a question about designing young minds, because you're an educator and you're teaching in a very, very good design school. I'm interested in your pedagogical approaches to shaping the moral compass of the new designers. Obviously, they're a little bit on defense. They are living with a lot of anxieties. They're dealing with scarcity and environmental concerns and so on. But there's also a lot of need for pushing design, so that as a new tool, as a medium that can address a lot of these problems, right? By changing the way people interact with the spaces, behaviors, and so on. So, what is your strategy to make more of people who more of your students follow your way of thinking, or maybe different ways of thinking, but also push the field further for different things that we are not going to be achieved because of our generation, the future generation designers?
I try not to make them follow my way of thinking, and in the Netherlands, certainly there's a rigor around education, which, as you probably know, is really about the teacher acting as a coach. So what we endeavour to do is to get them to be the strongest version of themselves. So there are many different characters that come out of the school. It being the Netherlands, it's often quite entrepreneurial. It's part of the culture, but also quite socially minded. You have a lot of sort of rather activist characters who come out of that system. It's an extraordinary country when you think about it, how small it is. I mean, it's sort of 15 million people, and you look at what comes out of it. So there's a reason for that. So I think what we do is to challenge them to get the highest level of debate we can, but ultimately they have to have their own obsessions. I don't think you can impose your obsessions on them, but you can certainly expose, if you like, areas of concern that are interesting to discuss and hand them over to them. One of the other things the school does, which I think is really quite interesting, apart from giving them the tools of the design process and the skills to be able to execute it is that in the third year, they do a project that's an external project. They work a lot with externalities. So, you know, my students have worked with the island of Réunion on looking at the future of craft, with an area in the north of Holland that wanted to figure out how you could attract young people to live there. They get to work on real projects as part of their education, and I think that's fantastic.
Hey, there is a trend in the past few years of co-working spaces that is now shifting into co-living. And I want to know what would be your advice when designing a space that needs to be both shared with strangers, but still to allow the users to call it a home?
It's a really good question, and actually one that we covered last semester. There's a very interesting developer in the Netherlands called Being Development who are developing housing that's doing that, and one of the people in that company is a former student of mine. And I think there are many answers to that, but it is about unpacking, really, the bits that need to be personal, which are actually quite small in the end, and certainly for the younger generation, they're used to them being really quite small, and then figuring out what are the possibilities and opportunities, really, in the public areas. And there were several projects. Many of them came up with very different responses to the brief, but all of them were extremely unlike the way that new housing is being built today.